In this Blender video, I'll be demonstrating how to make this animation. The Blender version that I'm using is 2.8 beta. Since this is a beta version of Blender, you should be aware that some of the things that I'll be showing might change. Also, version 2.8 is a major update to Blender, so if you're using an earlier version, then some of the things I'll be showing will be different. Let's start by creating a new project. So from the File menu, select New, and then General. We're going to be using this cube a little later, but for now let's hide it. So find it in the outliner and click the button that looks like an eye. And now we're going to add some text. So press Shift-A and select Text. Now rotate it on the X-axis by pressing R, then X, then 90, then Enter. Next, tab into Edit mode, delete the text and enter your own text. Then tab back into Object mode. Now we'll add some depth to the text. So switch to the Object Data panel and then open the Geometry section. Set the Extrude value to 0.1, the Bevel value to 0.02, and the Resolution value to 3. Next, we're going to add a Remesh modifier to the text. We're doing this to give the text a more uniform mesh. To see this better, I'll switch to Wireframe view by pressing Z, and then I'll select Wireframe. Now switch to the Modifiers panel and add a Remesh modifier. Then remove the check mark from next to Remove Disconnected Pieces so that the modifier will be applied to all of the letters in the text. Then add a check mark next to Smooth Shading. Next, we'll set the Octree depth value, which will determine how much detail the text will have. I'm going to use a value of 7. In general, the more letters that your text has, the higher you'll want to set this value. But don't set it too high because the text should look a little rough. The density of your mesh should look similar to what you see here. We're going to be using an image texture to give the text its color and texture. But for this to work properly, we first need to convert this text into a mesh. To do this, right-click the text and select Convert to Mesh. When we do this, it will also apply the Remesh modifier. Now select the Material panel and then click the New button. Name this material Concrete. We'll keep the default principled shader. For the base color, click the small button next to the white color and select Image Texture. I'm going to be using this image of a concrete floor. You can find a link to it in the video description. After you have an image to use, click the Open button, navigate to your image, and select it. Now press Z and select Look Dev. This will give us an idea of what this will look like before the lighting is set up. Next, we're going to unwrap the text so that Blender will know how we want the image to be applied to it. So tab into Edit mode. Then press A to select all. Now rotate the view until you can see the right side of the text and some of the top of the text. For the final render, we're going to be looking at the text from the left side. I found that if I unwrap the text from the opposite side from what the final render will use, then the results look very good. Now press U to unwrap and select Project from View Bounds. Now tab back into Object mode. To prevent the text from looking glossy, set the roughness value to 1. Now we'll give the text some texture, so open the Shading workspace. I'll zoom in so that we can see the text up close. The bottom window is where we can set up the nodes for this material. We're going to add a displacement node, so press Shift-A and select Vector. Here you should see Displacement and Vector Displacement. Select Displacement. Then connect the displacement output to the displacement input. Then connect the image color output to the height input. You can see the texture on the text, but it's too strong, so change the scale value to 0.1. The texture looks good with this value. Now switch back to the Layout workspace. Now let's work on the cube, so in the outliner, unhide the cube. Now press 1 on the number pad for front view. Then select the cube. Now press Z and select Wireframe so that we can see the cube and the text. Next, we're going to move and resize the cube. So tab into Edit Mode. Then press A to select all. Now press G and then X and center the cube over the text. Then scale it on the X-axis by pressing S, then X, then scale it until it's wider than the text. Now scale it on the Z-axis by pressing S, then Z, then 0.4, then Enter. Then move it on the Z-axis by pressing G, then Z, then align the bottom of the cube with the bottom of the text. Now we'll scale it on the Y-axis, so press S, then Y, then 0.2, then Enter. Next we'll add a bevel, so press Ctrl B, drag the mouse down to set the bevel size, and use the scroll wheel to set the number of segments. Then left-click to complete the operation. Next we're going to add a Remesh modifier to the cube, so tab into Object Mode. Then switch to the Modifiers panel and add a Remesh modifier. Set the Octree depth value to 6. Then click the Apply button. We need to apply the modifier so that when we unwrap the cube, it will unwrap based on the mesh that the Remesh modifier generates. Now press Z and select Look Dev to see what this looks like so far. Next, we're going to add a Wireframe modifier to give the inside of the cube more geometry and thickness. So add a Wireframe modifier. Set the thickness to 0.05. Sometimes you can get unwanted spikes when you use the Wireframe modifier. To prevent this, remove the check mark from next to Even Thickness. Also remove the check mark from next to Replace Original so that the original cube will still be visible. We want the wireframe to be located inside the cube, so change the offset value to -1. Next, let's set up the material for the cube. So switch to the Material panel. We're going to use the same material that we use for the text. So open the drop-down menu on the left side of the material name and select Concrete. Now we're going to unwrap the cube. So tab into Edit Mode and then press A to select all. Then press U to unwrap and select Cube Projection. Now tab back into Object Mode. This is a good time to save what I have so far. I'm going to name it text.blend. Now let's add an effect where we break apart the cube into pieces. So from the Object menu, select Quick Effects and then Quick Explode. You'll notice that it looks pretty strange now. We're going to be using the Cycles render engine for the final render, so it will look fine then. For now, press Z and select the solid view. Now switch to the Particles panel. Set the number of particles to 10,000. To make sure that the particles remain throughout the entire animation, set the lifetime to a value larger than the number of frames in the animation. I'm going to set it to 1,000. Next, set the frame end value to 10 and the start value to 2. These two values are only temporary. We'll be changing them later. Now open the Source section. Then add a check mark next to Use Modifier Stack so that the Wireframe modifier will be used. Now I'll click the Play button to see what this looks like so far. Some of the pieces look flat, so we're going to add a Solidify modifier. So switch to the Modifiers panel and add a Solidify modifier. Set the thickness to 0.03. Now I'll set the frame number to 1 and press play again. This looks better. Now we're going to set things up so that the cube will chip into pieces starting from the left side and continue to the right. We'll do this by adding a blend texture to the Particles system. So switch to the Particles panel. Then open the Texture section and click the New button. Now switch to the Texture panel. Make sure Particle Settings Texture is selected. For the type, select Blend. The default mapping coordinates value is set to generated. Change this to UV. Now we need to select which UV map we want to use. We created one earlier when we unwrapped the cube using cube projection. That one will not work well for what we're trying to do now, so we're going to unwrap it again. So tab into Edit mode. Then switch to the Object Data panel and open the UV Maps section. Then click the plus button to add a new map and name it Crumble. Now rotate the view until you're looking at the cube from the front. Then press U to unwrap and select Project from View Bounds. Now tab back into Object mode. Next, switch to the Texture panel. Now for the map, select the map that we just created named Crumble. When I click the play button now, the cube chips into pieces starting from the left side and it continues to the right. To gain even more control over this, open the Colors section and add a checkmark next to Color Ramp. Then open the Color Ramp section. You can change the direction that the pieces will chip off by clicking this arrow button and selecting Flip Color Ramp. Now if I play it, the pieces will chip off starting on the right. I'll switch it back now. Now let's add a floor for the cube to sit on. So press Shift-A and add a mesh plane. Then switch to the Material panel and click the New button. Change the base color to a hex value of E7-6F00. I'm going to keep all of the other default values. Now scale it up in size by pressing S, then 100, then Enter. Next we'll move it into position, so press 1 on the number pad for front view. Then press G to move and drag it to the bottom of the cube. Now when I press play, you'll notice that the pieces fall through the floor. To prevent this, switch to the Physics panel and click the Collision button. Now the pieces will bounce off of the floor instead of passing through it. To reduce the amount of bouncing, set the particle damping value to 0.7. Then to reduce how far the pieces will slide on the floor, set the particle friction value to 0.7. Then set the friction randomize value to 1 to add randomness to this. This is what it looks like now when I play it. Now the pieces don't fall through the floor and the amount of bouncing looks good. Also, the pieces don't slide too far. Next, let's work on the text. So go to the outliner and hide the cube by clicking the button that looks like an eye. Then select the text. We're going to make this text fall apart from the left to the right and then reassemble itself in a different spot. So from the Object menu, select Quick Effects and then Quick Explode. Now switch to the Particles panel. Change the number of particles to 10,000. Then set the frame end value to 10 and the start value to 2. These two values are only temporary. We'll be changing them later. Now we're going to make the text come apart from left to right. So in the Texture section, click the New button to add a texture. Then switch to the Texture panel. Select Particle Settings Texture 1 from the drop-down menu. For the type, select Blend. In the Mapping section, for the coordinates value, select UV. Then in the Map entry box, select UV Map. This is the UV map that we created earlier when we unwrapped the text. Now add a checkmark next to Color Ramp. Next, I'll press the play button to see what this looks like. The text comes apart from left to right, so this looks good. If yours is backwards, then click this arrow button and select Flip Color Ramp. Next, we're going to add a wireframe modifier to give the text more geometry and thickness. So switch to the Modifiers panel and add a wireframe modifier. To get rid of the spikes, remove the checkmark that's next to Even Thickness. Then remove the check mark that's next to Replace Original to bring back the original text. Then set the offset value to -1 so that the original text will be on the outside of the wireframe. Now I'll set the frame number to 1 and press play. The individual pieces look better. I'm going to save what I have so far. Next, we're going to duplicate the text and move it to the left. So press Shift-D to duplicate, then X to restrict the movement to the X-axis, then move the duplicate to the left. It's okay if the two texts overlap a little. This duplicate text by default is named Text 001. Now we're going to set things up so that when the pieces break off from the right side text, then they will move to the left side text. To do this, we'll use keyed physics. So switch to the Particles panel. Then open the Physics section, and for the physics type, select Keyed. Then open the Relations section. Now click the plus button to add a key. Then for the target object, select Text. This is the text on the right. Now click the plus button again to add another key. For the target object, select Text 001. This is the text on the left. This keyed physics setup will cause the pieces of the right side text to move to the left side text. When using keyed physics, the lifetime value controls the speed of the particles. Set this value to 30. Now set the frame end value to 90. Then set the frame start value to 20. Next, switch to the Modifiers panel. Then remove the checkmark that's next to Unborn, which will prevent the left side text from being seen until the broken pieces move into place. Now add a checkmark next to Dead so that the reassembled pieces will remain visible after they're done moving. Next, select the right side text. Then remove the checkmarks from next to Unborn and Alive so that this text will not be seen. Now I'll press play to see what this looks like. This runs a little slow, so I'll speed up the video for this part. You can see that at frame 20, the pieces start appearing on the right, and then they move to the left. When they reach their destination on the left, then the pieces start assembling into text. I'll set the frame number to 1. We're done setting up the text, so let's finish the cube. So go to the outliner and unhide the cube. Then select it. Now switch to the Particles panel and set the frame end value to 90. This is the same value that we used with the text. Then set the frame start value to 15. This is 5 frames before the text pieces start to move. This animation is going to be 150 frames long, so set the end frame value to 150. Now I'll press play. You'll notice that the pieces are not breaking off of the cube the way that we would expect. So I'll show you a sequence of 3 steps that seems to reset things and allows the animation to work as expected. The first step is to play the animation until the cube starts to crumble, which we've just done. The second step is to switch to the Modifiers panel and click this Refresh button. The third step is to switch to the Particles panel, open the Cache section, and click the Bake All Dynamics button. This is going to take a little while to bake, and so I'll pause the video until it's done. Baking is done. Later on, if the pieces are not breaking off of the cube correctly, you can follow these 3 steps again to reset things, but you need to click the Delete All Bakes button first. Now I'll set the frame number to 1 and press play again. I'll also speed up the video to make it play faster. This is looking good. Next, we'll set up the camera view, so press 0 on the number pad for camera view. This is the view looking through the camera. I'll zoom in a little. Now I'm going to lock the camera to the view. To do that, press N to open the Properties panel, select the View tab, and put a check mark next to Lock Camera to View. Then press N again to close the Properties panel. Now I can zoom, pan, and rotate while looking through the camera. Now I'll set up the view that I'd like to use. Next, let's set up the lighting. Some of the lighting settings are different for different render engines, so we'll select the render engine now. So select it by switching to the render panel and then select cycles. Now press 7 on the number pad for top view. Then in the outliner, find the plane and click the button that looks like an eye to hide the floor so that we can see the grid lines. If you don't see the grid lines, then open this drop-down menu and add a check mark next to Grid. Now select the lamp and press G to move. I'm going to put the lamp 3 large grid divisions above the left edge of the text. Then press 1 on the number pad for front view. Now press G again and drag the lamp until it's 5 large grid divisions above the bottom of the text. Next, switch to the Object Data panel. Make sure that the point lamp is selected and set the size to 3. Then set the power to 5000. Now let's see what this looks like. So press 0 on the number pad for camera view. Then in the outliner, find the plane and click the button that looks like an eye to unhide the floor. Now press Z and select Rendered. You'll notice that the text does not look right. To fix this, select the text and then switch to the Shading workspace. Then connect the output of the principled shader to the surface input of this node. Now switch back to the Layout workspace. The text looks much better now. Next, we're going to set the background color to black. So switch to the World panel, then set the color to black. Now the floor looks like it disappears into the distance. I'll switch back to Solid View now by pressing Z and then pressing Solid. Now let's set things up for the final render. So switch to the Render panel. The sampling section is where you set the number of render samples. The larger this value is, the better the final animation will look, but the longer it will take to render. I'm going to set it to 50. Now switch to the Output panel. I'm going to use the default resolution of 1920 by 1080. The Output directory is where you set the directory where your animation will be saved. Click on this button and navigate to the directory that you want to use. Then click this button to create a subdirectory. I'm going to name it Render. Now select the new directory and click Accept. Next, click here to set the file format. If you select an image format, then each frame will be rendered as an individual image. If you select a movie format, then the animation will be rendered as a single movie file. I'm going to select the PNG format, which will render each frame as an individual image. Now we're ready to render the animation, but I'm going to save the project first. It's a good idea to save the project before rendering in case something goes wrong during the rendering process. To render the animation, go to the Render menu and select Render Animation. When you render an animation, Blender opens a new window where you can see the progress of the render. If you want to stop the rendering process before it's done, then just close this new window. This is going to take a while to render, and so I'm going to pause the video until it's done. The animation is done rendering now. To play the animation, switch to the main Blender window, and from the Render menu select View Animation. If you would like to convert your animation into a single movie file, then you can watch my video on rendering an animation using Blender version 2.8. You can find a link to it in the video description. Well, that concludes this video. Thanks for watching, and please subscribe and leave a comment.